Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this week's episode, I want to talk about the problem as the solution. Now, what does this mean? The problem is the solution. Well, have you ever found yourself struggling with a problem and you return to the problem over and over and over again? And you have this feeling that if you can just find the key, almost as if there's some answer, some solution, some action you can take, and if you can just find it, then the problem will go away. In relationships, as an example, we can have tension with people. We can feel frustrated, and this frustration can be repeated. Not only in relationships with, for example, a coworker, but also with family members. And these patterns of always bumping into this problem can be long-standing, occurring really from our earliest memories in some instances. And so it occurs to me as I think about this idea of constantly coming up against the same problem, time and time and time again. What if the problem is the solution? What if the boundary that we're coming up against, the barrier, the block, the defense, what if it is actually a solution? Because the alternative to that problem, the alternative to having that kind of break wall, is actually something we fear more. So at first we might think, well, no, I live in a society that we want to be efficient, we want to solve problems, we want to get to the bottom of things, we want to do all these kinds of solution-focused approaches to our business relationships, our personal relationships, our happiness, everything. We want to fix it and move on to the next problem, almost like life is a to-do list. But what if life is not a to-do list? What if there's an aspect of our experience that has nothing to do with to-do lists? What if there's an aspect of our experience, a dimension of our experience, for which there is no goal to achieve? At a certain point, we may just ask ourselves, what exactly are we trying to solve? Now, as I started off this podcast talking, we are here to solve the problem. And so let's say the problem is a communication issue with somebody. And we decide we're going to get a book on how to communicate better. We decide we're going to talk to the person about the fact that we have communication issues. If we go to counseling or therapy, we go to a spiritual guru or a religious figure, we do whatever it is we do. And no matter what we do, the problem maintains the same position, really. It doesn't actually get any better. So we give up, we get frustrated, we think it's pointless, there's nothing I can do. Well, that's one option. One option is to say, there's nothing I can do. But what if we take a look at this problem, we say the problem is a solution, and what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling, is too great for me to tolerate. So let's think of an example of an individual in a family dynamic where the family is always fighting. And they may have some good times, but by and large, there's a pattern of fighting, of there always being this problem. And if you think about what's going on, when you think about what's going on in that experience, it seems like there must be some way to communicate better or to be more transparent or whatever it is. But then when you really start getting into it, and you really start to explore where communication might lead, then we can ask ourselves, can we actually talk about what's going on? If there is something almost political about a conflict going on in a family, if there's a real schism and there's no real mechanism in place to talk about it, then the crisis, the problem that's created, is the solution. It's the best way to not talk about the thing that cannot be spoken about. And this is where we get to the second piece. The first part being, the problem is the solution. And the second part being, can we speak that which cannot be spoken? Now, there are many experiences in our lives that are overwhelming to us, many experiences that we cannot bring ourselves to talk about. We become angry, we become frightened, we have feelings of shame, and these collide with other people's feelings, for example, in a family situation, and these collide in a way where we feel completely at the mercy of these responses. It's as if we've been thrown into a wild river. And all we're trying to do is grab hold of a big rock or something. And that's the most we can do. We can't really sit and try and figure out what's going on. We can't come up with a plan. We are completely and totally overwhelmed. So we are not able to speak about that which cannot be spoken. So we have the problem is the solution, and we have that which cannot be spoken. Now, there's a feeling that we have. This is the third part. There's a feeling that we have about that which cannot be spoken. It's going to be one of two things. There's a fear or there's an anxiety. The fear occurs if what's going on for us is a present threat. So somebody's going to attack us, or we have to jump out of the way of a car, or these kinds of things. So if we take fear off the list, what we're left with is anxiety. So we've gone from the problem is the solution to we cannot speak about that which is unspoken to anxiety. Now, what happens when we feel anxiety? Well, we want to stop that feeling. We find a way to stop it. We may avoid, we may project, we may ruminate, we may intellectualize, we may do any number of things. And what's that's referred to is a defense. And the defense is like a break wall that stops us from getting completely lost in the undercurrent of the anxiety, which is taking us and throwing us down the river. We have no control. Remember, we're just trying to get a hold of a big rock or a log or something, but we actually have no control. So we've got the problem is the solution, the thing that is unspoken, the thing that cannot be spoken. And now then we get into this question of anxiety, right? And versus fear. So we're talking about anxiety. And now we're talking about the defense. And this is where it actually circles back. The defense, which creates the block, is the solution. It's the problem that is the solution. It's the thing that is in some way addressing that which cannot be spoken, which creates the anxiety. So if you imagine where we started as if it's a circle, the problem is the solution, we have the thing that cannot be spoken, we have anxiety as a response, and then we have defense, which is synonymous with the problem is the solution. Then you can see how we get locked into a pattern. You can see how in relationships where we can't break out of that circle, that cycle, we can't move to another level, layer, stage, whatever you want to call it, another paradigm. And by getting locked into the defense / the problem being the solution, we cannot actually move outside of the anxiety to defense response. So, how do we break out of these patterns? I'd like to say that there's just this simple, 3 steps you can take, or take some breaths, or whatever it is. And of course, there are things that we can do to help regulate ourselves. But the truth is, we're learning to live with conflict. We're learning to live with a greater degree of complexity that we do not have words for yet. And that's why we are faced with the thing that cannot be spoken. Another way of thinking about that is we are faced with a paradox. So the thing that cannot be spoken is a paradox. It's a contradiction that we cannot remedy with a binary solution. So we are faced with this immovable truth, this reality. And we can wish it away, we can want it to go away, we can try and avoid it, we can project and say it's somebody else's fault, we can intellectualize, rationalize, we can do any number of things that are defenses. But notice, we are going round and round and round and round. And the only way to move to another paradigm is to see and acknowledge and accept the paradox. Doesn't mean you have to like it, doesn't mean you agree with it, doesn't mean you think it's fair and whatever else. But we're accepting in that moment the paradox of our situation, which is we want, and in our wanting, we create an expectation, we create a projection. And within that projected worldview, we have an answer that solves the crisis, solves the paradox. And so we can imagine we're free from the paradox. We can get reprieve from the paradox. But then something happens that comes along and shakes us and says that which cannot be spoken remains. The paradox remains. And so we are faced with that which we cannot understand, that which we cannot fix. There is no solution. There is no 5 steps to this, 4 steps to that. We are now faced with expanding our perspective, adapting the complexity of our understanding. We are now faced with enduring these rifts, these schisms that exist in, for example, families, work relationships, other kinds of dynamics that we as individual egos, no matter how much we fantasize, do not have control over. So that's kind of the first part of this podcast, that we have the problem is the solution, which, as I said, is really a defense. And we hold on to the defense because the alternative is we have to try and face that which we cannot speak. And that which we cannot speak creates this anxiety. The second part of the podcast is talking about the illusions and the delusions, the ways in which we engage and we fantasize to get ourselves out of this. And so what happens is we start to think about and imagine, we fantasize. If I had $1 million, all my problems would go away because I could pay for the problems to go away. If I lived in a bigger place, all my problems would go away. If I lived in this, if I lived in that, if I had this job, I'd be happy. If I was in this relationship, I'd be happy. Whatever it is that we're thinking. And so everything is a wish. And we want to fulfill that wish to be happy. Now, we call this freedom, right? We say, well, then I would be free. But really what we're talking about is control. We're talking about the will of our wish, or our willing of our wish, would be the reality which we would then be happy in. Now, this is control. The actual truth of freedom is we don't want freedom. Interestingly, we want to be freed from freedom, because freedom creates this complexity in our relationships that sets in motion these kinds of paradoxes that create the anxiety that we are trying to wish ourselves away from. And what's striking is we're drawn to freedom, which would require the freedom of others, because the freedom of one that doesn't include the freedom of others is not freedom, it's tyranny in whatever form. It's control in whatever form. And if our freedom is really about control, then what we're doing is we're saying, I need to reduce the complexity. I need to adopt a reductionist attitude of understanding my experience. But that just creates, as we talked in the first part of the podcast, the problem as a solution, i.e., the defense. If we are going to break out of the defense, if we are going to become free, then we need to seek freedom from freedom, which is to say we need to seek freedom from the illusion that our projection is reality. Now, this is not to say we should not engage in our illusions. In fact, mentalizing can be a powerful way for us to start to think and engage in all sorts of new opportunities, new perspectives, potential in short. And we may find new ways, interesting ways to bridge and explore and discover within the complexity. So all of a sudden the paradox becomes an impetus towards something that is greater than that which we know. And that leads us away from the reductionist view, i.e. leads us away from this idea that I need to be fixed and have things in control. I can actually move to a dynamic where I am expanding. And the added quality of this is I don't know, which is a natural counter to having control. And the question is, can I have a relationship that includes not knowing? And this is where it goes back to that idea of the problem is the solution, aka the defense. Because if I have to know, then I have created a defense against anxiety, the thing that is the paradox. And if I've created a defense against the thing that is the paradox, I've created a defense against unknowing. And if I have done that, I have locked myself in because I am seeking freedom from freedom. Just to unpack that a little bit more, remembering that freedom is the idea that I will be actualized in some way, but that's control. If freedom is about the tyranny I have, the control I have, the way in which I can manipulate others, that's control. So to seek freedom from freedom is to seek freedom from the illusion of control over others, of unifying principles of we should all love each other. It is seeking freedom from the rhetoric of control, regardless of our intentions. It is seeking freedom from the rhetoric of our control, which is the problem that we've created as the solution. It's the defense against the unknown. Now, why does this matter? If you're going into any situation and you have this operational idea of this is what this means when I meet this kind of person or I'm in this kind of situation, you have predetermined, you have in your thoughts structured a binary that has an opposite, and that opposite is embedded within a hierarchy. So what this means is we are going in within a mode of understanding, an epistemological frame that to speak is to speak in opposition to, that means a binary, and within that binary there is a hierarchy. One is better than the other. That's control. That's not a paradox. A paradox means we are engaged in something that has no, as we understand it, conceptual frame to demarcate what is or isn't. The paradox is you could say the introspective kind of experience of reflection on an introspective experience. It's like who's watching the watcher in Eastern philosophy. Because you ask, well, in Turtles All the Way Down, the idea being that you have this infinite regress. And within this infinite regress, within this kind of who's watching the watcher, Turtles All the Way Down, you have this idea that there is always something more, always something more. Like those little Russian dolls. You pull open and there's another one, you pull open, there's another one. And what that suggests is that the pattern of thinking is in and of itself paradoxical. It's cyclical. It doesn't actually lead to anything other than itself. It's infinite regress or whatever you want to call it, but it's fundamentally operating as a constructivist understanding of what things are. And so if I come into my understanding about the experience of life with a constructivist notion, this is what right wing is, this is what left wing is, this is what, this political group, that political group, all these kinds of things, then what I've done is I've come in with a constructed notion of the world, but they don't actually exist. And the paradox reveals that it doesn't exist. That's why it's a crisis. Who are we if we do not have and are not embedded within that way of understanding ourselves? So here's a personal example. I'm going through a bunch of stuff and becoming a therapist, and it's kind of problematic. And so it threatens me becoming a therapist, right? It creates this anxiety in my life. And then it occurred to me, I wanted to be a musician, and I still play, but it's not like I became this successful musician who plays all the time and all these different things. I wanted to be in the film business, and similarly, I did, a bunch of work, but am I really a musician? Am I really a filmmaker, a film editor, or a film composer? Am I really a composer? Am I really a therapist? These are things that I do, right? These are problems that are my solution. These are my answers to the paradox of existence, that I will one day die, that many things in my life will not be realized, that life is unfair, life is confusing, all of these different things. Who I am is the problem that is the solution. Now, this may seem like a really cynical way of looking at life, but the point of it is not to be cynical. The point of it is to acknowledge that we're constructing a way of existing, and that it does liberate us, you could say, from the anxiety of life. But if we become trapped in that illusion, then we are afraid of living. In other words, even though it came in a moment of despair when I thought to myself, I'm not really a musician, I'm not really a filmmaker, I'm not really a therapist, a part of me felt a release. I'm actually not those things. I do those things, but I am not those things. And I remember my father said, a conversation we had, not too long ago, he's 83 and he's been painting since his, a kid. So, almost 80 years or whatever it was when he started. And I said, well, you're an artist. And he goes, no, I'm not an artist. I said, well, what do you mean? You've been painting, since 5 or 6 or, whenever you started drawing and all the rest of it. And he goes, no, I'm involved with art. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, once you become something, then you step into a whole world of identity, a whole world of rules. But if you're just involved with it, you can move in and out. You're not defined by that kind of shell, that persona. And that's really stuck with me, because why is it that we create a persona? Well, if it's the problem that is the solution, if it is the way in which we stave off anxiety, stave off the thing that cannot be spoken, then really what I'm saying is not cynical. It's simply descriptive of the fact that we become in order to not be enveloped by being. That doing is an act of expression, beautiful expression, unique expression, traumatic expression, brutal expression. And this ontic experience, this individual experience of this discovery, is a kind of fallacy that is a beautiful fallacy. Yet, can we acknowledge that the escape that we seek, the problem that is the solution, the defense, is not who we are? Can we stand back and recognize and acknowledge that these defenses, these blocks, these barriers, that we in whatever way use, in whatever way must hold on to, shape a larger frame as to who we are in relation to others and how we can or cannot free ourselves from the goals, the aspirations, the doing, the succeeding, the solutions, all this kind of stuff. And we move away from being the doer and we start to think, well, what is it about my experience? What is it about the experience of being kind of freed from the expectation of whatever my defense is or whatever my problem as solution is? So just to circle back, the main point of all this is to see that our response to something is like a painting. We are creating an image of something that is experiential. And the reason why this is interesting to me is we can forget or not realize that we are actually creating an image of our lives that we are then associating ourselves with for a very fundamental reason, which is by knowing ourselves in whatever way, we can know that we exist. And we can do this through many different ways. It can be negative, positive, doesn't really matter. But that's also why it doesn't matter that it's negative or positive. That's why it matters that that behavior, even if it's self-destructive, self-aggrandizing, whatever it is, narcissistic, really doesn't matter. Because the problem is the solution. We are connected to that which cannot be spoken. Yet, to be connected to that which cannot be spoken in that way means we start to ask questions about who we are. And maybe I'm not a musician, maybe I'm not a filmmaker, maybe I'm not a therapist, maybe I'm not a man, maybe I'm not any of these things. So as we start to kind of play with this idea of who and what is experienced beyond the doer, maybe we can step into an understanding that moves away from the problem as a solution, moves away from the defense, and allows us to expand and explore. That we seek freedom from freedom, not because freedom or the concept of freedom is a problem, because rather the idea of escaping our authentic experience leads us down a path which creates a very different set of expectations for our relationships. And these expectations collide with others. So, I hope you found this interesting. This idea of the problem is the solution, and this idea that we seek freedom from freedom are two concepts I've been thinking about over the past week or so. And this has been a way for me to kind of play with these ideas. I'm not fixed to any certain, idea of what should or shouldn't happen, but I like this idea of exploring the problem as a solution, which is a kind of paradoxical statement, and I like the idea of freedom from freedom, which is another paradoxical statement, and that within that we may kind of reassess how we look at problems, solutions, and freedom and control. So thanks a lot, and bye for now.